Hey guys, Steinixos here. So today we'll be discussing Haki. Specifically, we'll be going over what Haki is, as well as we'll be reviewing the various Haki techniques. Now on the surface, Haki seems like a fairly simple concept. However, it's a little more complicated than many people realize, and there's quite a few misconceptions out there. For example, I've seen quite a few people who think that Armament Haki functions like Karaseki's Sea Stone by nullifying a Devil Fruit user's power. However, this is just false, because as Robin points out at Punk Hazard, it only allows interaction with the Devil Fruit user. It doesn't prevent them from using their power. So let us see if we can clear up all of these misconceptions and get a better understanding of Haki. So with that said, let's get into it. Now, the obvious first question that we need to answer is, well, what is Haki? Now, Haki itself is a very vague thing. The kanji for Haki is composed of Ha and Ki, with Ha meaning conqueror or sovereignty, and Ki meaning things like willpower and life force. And Rayleigh describes Haki to be a fundamental power that is similar to other fundamental concepts, such as presence, spirit, or aura that is within every living being that everyone kind of intuitively knows exists, but doesn't really understand in any meaningful way. So the general gist of this is that Haki is some fundamental energy present in all living things. However, it is important that you understand that there is not only one type of this fundamental energy known as Haki, but rather there are at least two types. Let me explain. So as we already stated, just like presence, spirit, or aura, there's a type of Haki that is present in every single human being from birth. Though they may never notice or learn to use this Haki, it is still there and present in everyone without exception. So this type of Haki that everyone has we'll be calling normal Haki. And as a aside point, this energy known as normal Haki in Wano is called Ryu. However, there's also a second type of Haki known as Conqueror's Haki. Now in comparison to normal Haki, Conqueror's Haki is not present in everyone. As a matter of fact, only 1 in every few million persons are born with Conqueror's Haki, and there is no current way to get it after birth. So if you weren't born with this fundamental energy known as Conqueror's Haki, then you'll just never have it. And just to reiterate the fact that normal Haki and Conqueror's Haki are two different energies, Armament Haki, put very simply, is just the formation of an armor made of this fundamental thing known as Haki. However, you'll note that in the fight against Kaido, Luffy realizes that you can use Conqueror's Haki to form a different armor type than the one you get when using Armament Haki. And we know it is a different armor because if Conqueror's Haki did not use a different version of this fundamental thing known as Haki than the version that Armament Haki uses, then it wouldn't really make any sense to point out that you can infuse Conqueror's Haki too. Because if the Haki used in both cases were the same, then you'd just be infusing more of the same thing that we already knew you could infuse. And that is obviously not what this statement is saying. This statement implies that the Haki that you infuse in Armament Haki is different than the Haki that you infuse during Conqueror's Haki. And later in the fight, it was explicitly confirmed that normal Haki and Conqueror's Haki are indeed two separate energies, given that Luffy, who has both of these energies, was infusing his punches with both normal Haki and Conqueror's Haki. So in summary, Haki is a fundamental energy that has at least two different types. Normal Haki or Ryu, which everyone has, and Conqueror's Haki, which only a few persons are born with. Now, given that we have these fundamental energies known as Haki, there must be a way to use these energies. So a Haki technique literally just describes the ways in which you can use the fundamental energies known as Haki. So this is just like in Naruto, where you have the specific energy known as chakra, and jutsus are the techniques or the ways in which you can use chakra. So this is why, for example, when Luffy demonstrated internal destruction, which is one of the ways you can use Haki, Hyoguru says to Luffy that he's demonstrated an application or use type of normal Haki, which remember is also called Ryu, which he himself does not know how to do, thus he can't teach it. So currently, there are three main classes of ways that you can use Haki. The first class of usage is for perceptual techniques, and this class of usage is called observation Haki. Secondly, you can use Haki for coating or infusion techniques, which when done using normal Haki is called Armament Haki, and when done with Conqueror's Haki has no special name. You just call it Conqueror's Haki coating or Conqueror's Haki infusion. And then thirdly, you can use Haki for spirit or will subjugation techniques, but this use method, unlike coating or infusion, can only be done with Conqueror's Haki. You can't do it with normal Haki. So with that now understood, let us get into a discussion about observation Haki, which, remember, as we said before, are just perceptual techniques done by using Haki. Now, there are 4 types of perceptual techniques that can be done with Haki. You have present sensing, predictive sensing, future sight, and emotion sensing. Now, with basic observation Haki, you are able to sense the presence, position, and number of living things over a given range, regardless of if your eyes can see them or not. So for example, Zoro, Luffy, and Sanji were able to sense Karibo, who was outside of their line of sight. And we have also seen where Usopp was able to sense the position of Law, Luffy, and Sugar, even though he couldn't see them directly. Now, it is at this point some people will argue that observation Haki only allows you to see things that are actually visible but are outside of your line of sight, meaning it does not allow you to see things that are actually invisible, like Absalom using the invisible devil fruit, Soul Reapers from Bleach, and Madara's Limbo clones. Now, this stance merely stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of observation Haki. Remember, observation Haki is the process of sensing presence, a fundamental concept that is intrinsic to all living beings. The thing that we're calling presence or aura, as I've already explained to you, is obviously not something that is tied to whether an individual is visible or invisible. It is tied to that living being's literal life itself. A good way of thinking about this is as Gunfall stated, the bodies of all living things, by virtue of being alive, all have a kind of metaphysical voice of their existence. That voice obviously doesn't suddenly disappear just because you turn invisible. The voice is literally tied to your life itself. We know this because when Doflamingo was manhandling Law, bringing him within an inch of death, Luffy could tell that Law had not yet died because his metaphysical voice that you can sense with observation Haki had not disappeared yet. This is further illustrated by the fact that when Sanji, who was in Nami's body at the time, was having difficulty locating Keimon's torso with observation Haki, he attributed this to the fact that it was likely that its actual life force was decreasing to such a level that it became difficult to differentiate it from lower life forms such as that of a regular fish. And it was confirmed that that was actually the case because a shark was literally biting into the torso. As a matter of fact, you'll note that Keimon's torso was able to sense and fight Brook using observation Haki. Remember, Brook is literally just a soul occupying a skeleton. Again, just to hammer this in, Brook is literally just a soul occupying a skeleton. So we know for a fact that observation Haki is not dependent on whether you are literally visible or not. Nor is it dependent on whether you have certain organs or not. Nor is it dependent on whether you have some specific form of energy or not. And again, this is because, as we have already said, at the most basic level, observation Haki is merely the process of sensing a concept that is fundamentally intertwined with life itself. You are literally sensing an individual's presence. And this obviously would not be dependent on whether they are actually visible to the naked eye or not. And this is further explored in the fact that observation Haki allows you to sense the emotions of others. Emotions obviously don't just disappear because someone's body is invisible. Emotions themselves aren't even visible in the first place. They are not even tangible or real in the same way that you would say a rock is real. Emotions are real in the sense that they are emergent, intangible concepts that form part of an individual's personal experience. And observation Haki allows you to sense this. We see where Queen Otahime was able to sense the cries coming from Fisher Tiger's heart. Now, it is important to note that emotion sensing is not something everyone can do to the same degree. Rayleigh explicitly said that Luffy seemed particularly in tune with emotion sensing. And it's not like Queen Otahime consciously trained Haki at all, much less trained to be able to sense emotions specifically. So a person's ability to sense emotions and the degree to which they are able to do it seems to mostly be an unconscious thing, of which the mastery does not necessarily increase as your overall mastery of observation Haki increases. Now, basic observation Haki also allows you to gauge someone's strength level. So for example, using observation Haki, Rayleigh in real time was able to sense all the animals on the island that he was training Luffy on, and then again, in real time, he was able to precisely quantify that about 500 of these animals were currently stronger than Luffy. We also see where Kobe used observation haki to see that Kiros was strong upon meeting him, and in Wano, Hawkins was immediately able to tell that Law, who was disguised at the time, was a strong opponent, again by using observation haki. Basic observation haki also allows you to be able to sense intent. And as Rayleigh said, through this intent you are able to predict what someone is going to do. So for example, this is why a person using basic observation haki can predict the pathway of projectiles like water bullets. To put it more clearly, that is because Hordy had an intent behind the throw of each bullet of water. And this is very important because, as you could have probably guessed, if someone is moving without intent, even though you could still sense them and know their position with basic observation haki, you would not be able to predict their attacks. We see this, for example, when Luffy started to act solely on instinct. He was able to dodge all of Enel's attacks, despite Enel's basic observation haki. We also saw this again in the same fight of Luffy versus Enel, where Luffy punched the wall randomly, thus allowing his hand to ricochet randomly. Thus Enel could not predict the trajectory of these attacks since they had no intent. It was entirely random. But this is where we can now get into advanced observation haki, because in contrast to basic observation haki, where you are just predicting based on intent, with advanced observation haki, predictions and intent are just thrown out the window and you are now literally looking into the future. Thus it does not matter if a person is randomly attacking or not, you will see it. That is why advanced observation haki is called future sight, because you are literally seeing the future. But remember, future sight isn't just limited to seeing what a person will do. Katakuri even literally hears the words that Jagger was going to say. So advanced observation haki is a transcendental level that gives you literal knowledge of the future. The next important concept about observation haki is that it works independently of your body's normal 5 physical senses. At a fundamental level, you should already know this to be true, because Luffy's entire observation haki training was shown to be him learning to see and predict things while keeping his eyes closed. And I mean, we have Fujitora, who is literally blind, so we know that they are separate. But some of you may think that all this shows is that observation haki doesn't depend on the sense of sight, but it could still depend on some other sense, such as hearing. After all, Fujitora and Luffy's ears weren't closed. So let us further illustrate the independence of observation haki from the other senses and even from the brain itself by taking a look at Keimon. So on Punk Hazard, Keimon's body was split into 3 different segments by law: a head segment, a torso segment, and a lower body leg segment. And all of these segments were then separated from each other over far distances. So we know for a fact that the head segment was not controlling and had no idea what the torso and the leg segments were doing. So firstly, we clearly see where Keimon's lower body leg segment was able to sense Luffy and his crew and see what they were doing using observation haki. Then we were also shown where the torso segment, which was moving independently from the leg segment, was also navigating its own entirely different environment by using observation haki. And this torso segment was even able to accurately fight against Brook by using observation haki. And I'll repeat, we know that it is not the case that the head segment was receiving input from the torso segment and then coordinating their movement. No, his legs and torso were literally moving independently of the head and of each other by using observation haki. So we can be pretty sure that observation haki is completely independent of these normal 5 senses and even the brain itself. So this is important because this means that techniques like genjutsu, which distorts your body's normal physical senses, would be easily seen through by observation haki, since observation haki works independently of these senses to begin with. The next thing I want to talk about is the natural range of observation haki. So as Gunfall said, observation haki can be trained to increase its range. So for example, we know that Kobe trained his observation haki to be much further than Helmeppo, as he was able to sense the pirate submarine and torpedo, whereas Helmeppo, his training partner, could not. And we also know that the priests of Skypiea trained their observation haki to be able to pick up the entirety of Upper Yard. And remember, Upper Yard is an island in and of itself. And as I had already mentioned, we know that Rayleigh's observation Haki's range is at least that of the size of an island, given that he was able to sense all the animals on the island on which he was training Luffy. But just viewing range in terms of islands may be a little lackluster for some of you. After all, islands vary widely in size, and it is just nice sometimes to have a literal distance you can reference. So to give you an actual distance that someone attained with training, let us take a look at former Admiral Aokiji. So Aokiji met Luffy and a bunch of stranded people on one of the islands of the Long Ring Long Land. Now the stranded people needed to travel across the ocean and over 3 islands. So Aokiji literally froze this entire distance, allowing them to walk to their destination. Now obviously for him to freeze this exact distance with precision, he had to use observation Haki. He couldn't just be guessing here. Now in the anime, we were told that it would take 4 days to get to their destination, and thus Aokiji made sure his ice would last 7 days. Now the average walking speed of an adult is 3 to 4 miles per hour. But let us assume that these people were walking even slower than an 89-year-old at 2 miles per hour. And let us also assume that Aokiji expected them to walk only 8 hours out of a day. This still means that the minimum distance they must have traveled in those 4 days is 64 miles or 103 kilometers. So we know that Aokiji's observation Haki is at minimum 103 kilometers. Now this is obviously pretty cool, but as we had already said, sensing distances of entire islands and above is a basic feat at the higher levels of observation Haki. Now what we were just focusing on is the ability to increase the range of observation Haki solely through training it. But the next major thing we need to talk about is the fact that observation Haki can also be enhanced with the use of devil fruits. Remember how we stated that the Skypian priests trained their observation Haki to be able to pick up the entirety of Upper Yard? But you'll note that while Gunfall was telling us this, he also mentioned that Enel's observation Haki ranged even further to include both Upper Yard and the Angel Island. Now this by itself isn't anything surprising, because as we already know, you can train observation Haki to increase its range. So Enel could have just trained his observation Haki to achieve this extended range. However, what was special about Enel is that even though he only had basic observation Haki, he not only knew the position of everyone, like anyone with basic observation Haki is able to do, but he could also literally hear their conversations. Now he could do this because his Lightning Devil Fruit enables him to pick up electric signals in the air, which he explained both increase the effective range of his observation Haki and allows him to actually hear what people are literally saying when they speak. So we were actually introduced to this idea of enhancing your observation Haki using your devil fruit from quite early in the series. And the other example of someone who we know is likely also doing this is Fujitora. So as an admiral, we know that Fujitora's observation Haki would obviously be far above that of the Skypian priests, who could already cover an entire island, and at least at the level of his fellow admirals like Aokiji. And we also know that Fujitora blinded himself and now sees the world entirely using his observation Haki. Thus he is constantly reliant on his observation Haki to replace his sense of sight. And this alone likely already made his observation Haki far greater than that of his fellow admirals. But if these were the only things that we were considering, I probably would have said that his observation Haki could extend at most to about a continent or two, and I definitely would not have said that it could extend to outer space. But here's the thing, we know that he can and does extend it to outer space. This is because at any given moment, he can precisely summon a meteor from outer space. Now, even though it hasn't explicitly been confirmed, it is likely that the reason he can summon these meteors with such precision is because, like Enel, he is combining his observation Haki with his gravity powers to pick up the gravitational waves which permeate space, and thus he can decide how much gravity to send up to attract a meteor of a specific size and position from outer space at any given moment. It also explains why he could precisely target and pick up all of the inanimate rocky debris that were left scattered and just lying around after Dressrosa was mostly destroyed. And this to me makes way more sense than saying things like he fires up a random amount of gravity in a random direction and just hopes that it comes in contact with a meteor of appropriate size that amount of gravity can attract. Or saying that he creates meteors himself and that he keeps a constant supply of these meteors above the clouds, carries them around with him, and then summons one whenever he needs it. Now I would hope that I don't need to explore these arguments for you to see why they don't really make much sense. So with that, we can move on to our next topic, which is what affects observation Haki actually being on. In the anime, we have seen where, when Sanji was searching for Keimon's torso, at first he was just looking with his eyes, and then he made the conscious decision to turn on his observation Haki. But you'll note that there are characters like Asia, who literally had observation Haki from birth and cannot turn it off. Now the reason for this is pretty simple. It is merely a matter of training. To illustrate this, we need only look to Kobe. You'll realize that when Kobe first awakened his observation Haki at Marineford, he could not control it or turn it off. But post time skip, we see where Kobe has complete control over his observation Haki and is now even better than Helmeppo. The reason is that training allows you to do this. Asia didn't train to learn observation Haki. It was basically just a natural additional sense that she was born with. But since she did not train like Kobe, she cannot turn it off. You'll also note where characters like Katakuri say you have to remain focused to use observation Haki. Now this is true as a general principle, but it is still highly dependent on the individual. With Asia, for example, we see where it just happens naturally. It's not like as a baby or a toddler she was intensely focusing. And we see that it continues to stay on even in situations where we can clearly see she is visibly scared and shaken up by it. And a healthier but still sick Whitebeard had trained his observation Haki to the level where he was able to keep it on even while he was sleeping. And even with Katakuri, once he decides that he's going to keep focused, there isn't really anything you can do to stop it. So this particular aspect doesn't really play that big of a role. So now let us move on to Armament Haki, which is just normal Haki derived coating or infusion techniques. Now at a basic level, Armament Haki just describes a process of materializing this fundamental energy known as Haki and using it for 4 primary functions. And these functions are facilitating interactions, the modification of things, use as a primary attack method, and for defense. So the first and arguably the most complicated function of Armament Haki is its interaction function. And to properly understand this function, you need to first understand why a Logia is nearly invincible. So Logias by their very nature are literally a certain element and literally has that element's properties. So Kizaru, who ate the light fruit, literally is light and thus has the properties of light. One such property of light is intangibility, which means he can literally just stand still and do absolutely nothing, and most attacks will just go right through him. So as you could imagine, if a literal property of your body is that you cannot be touched, that in itself would grant you almost complete invulnerability, being that an attack typically needs to be able to interact with you before it can even have a chance of hurting you. But this isn't actually why a Logia is nearly invincible. It is only part of the story. For example, Scratchman Appo's attacks are unique in that once you hear it, it just automatically takes effect. And thus through this mechanism, Appo's attack was able to bypass Kizaru's intangibility and actually interact with Kizaru's body, cutting off his arm and literally blowing his body into pieces, resulting in his upper body being literally separated from his lower body. So through this special automatic mechanism of his attack, he was able to satisfy the first condition of actually interacting with Kizaru's body rather than his attacks just going right through, as we had seen with Brook's sword attacks and Usopp's explosive pellets. Yet you'll note that despite this, he wasn't actually able to hurt Kizaru. Kizaru was absolutely uninjured and he just casually reformed his body as if nothing had happened at all. So this is actually the fundamental point that you need to understand. The reason why Kizaru can't normally be hurt is not just because you can't normally touch him. No. Being able to interact with Kizaru's body is merely the first obstacle that an attack needs to be able to overcome to even have a chance of hurting him. But the actual fundamental reason why Kizaru can't normally be hurt is because even if you find a way to interact with his body, that doesn't change the fact that light isn't a thing that has the property of being able to be hurt. So even though Scratchman's Apple's attack, through its special mechanism, was able to pass the first obstacle of actually interacting with Kizaru's body, all he accomplished was just cutting and blowing apart light. His attack did not address the fundamental problem that Kizaru is light and light cannot be hurt. So this is why you usually cannot hurt Logias, even the ones who have elements that you can normally touch. Take Aokiji for example, who we know is the Ice Logia. Ice is a solid element, thus unlike light you can usually touch it under normal circumstances. So whereas a regular bullet or a regular sword attack or any other regular physical attack literally just goes through Kizaru without him having to do anything at all, for Aokiji, a regular physical attack like a punch under normal circumstances would obviously physically impact with him. And again, this is because ice is solid, therefore it does not require any special mechanism to normally touch it. But you'll note that even after being completely broken apart by Robin, Aokiji just casually reforms, having sustained no damage whatsoever. The same is true after being broken up into even finer pieces by Luffy. So again, the fundamental reason you cannot hurt a Logia is because natural elements such as ice or magma or light do not have the property of being able to be hurt. And then compounded onto this is that there are some Logias like Kizaru and Enel who have the additional property of intangibility, so it is hard for an attack to even touch them in the first place. So with this understanding of why Logias are nearly invincible, we can now explain what it means when I say Armament Haki grants the ability to interact. So Armament Haki actually grants the ability to interact in two ways that solves the two obstacles of a Logia's invulnerability. Firstly, it allows you to interact with things in ways that you wouldn't normally be able to interact with them. This put simply means that it solves the first problem of being able to touch things you wouldn't normally be able to touch. So to understand what I mean by this, let us take the example of Smoker, who ate the smoke fruit and thus is a smoke man. So surely you would understand that you can't normally interact with smoke in the same way that you can interact with a rock. Like you can normally grab onto and hold a rock for example, but you can't normally grab onto or hold smoke. Your hand would obviously just go right through. Even with liquids like water for example, you can actually touch and hold water in your hand, but you can't usually interact with smoke like this, being that it is a gas. So this is what it means when we say you can't touch smoke. And this is why when pre-timeskip Sanji tried to kick Smoker, his kick just went right through. Similarly, when pre-timeskip Luffy tried to punch Smoker, his punches also just went right through. And if you try to cut him, that also just goes right through. So like Kizaru, Smoker is the type of Logia that you have to solve the first obstacle of even being able to touch him in the first place, before you can even think about hurting him. But with Armament Haki, you gain this interaction ability. So as we can see here, using Armament Haki, Luffy is literally able to grab onto and hold smoke, thus treating a gas as if it were a solid. So this is what Rayleigh meant when he said Armament Haki forces them into solidity. It does not mean that the Logia actually become solid or that their devil fruit powers are nullified or cancelled. No, Smoker's arm is clearly in its gaseous form here. What Haki does is that it allows you to interact with things in ways that you wouldn't normally be able to interact with them. So in the case of Luffy versus Smoker, and that means allowing Luffy to touch and interact with the gaseous substance smoke as if it were a solid. And similarly, in the case of Rayleigh versus Kizaru, that means allowing Rayleigh to touch and actually interact with the intangible element of light as if it were a solid. So that is the first interaction function of Armament Haki. The second interaction function of Armament Haki is that it allows you to interact with the fundamental essence of a thing. This solves the second and the fundamental obstacle of a Logia's invulnerability. To understand what I mean by this, let us take a look at Aokiji once more. So as we had said before, ice is something that you can usually touch. So So even a pre-time skip Nico Robin who cannot use Armament Haki was able to interact with and completely shatter Aokichi's body using a normal physical attack. But as we said, it didn't actually hurt Aokichi. But fast forward to the Marineford arc and we see where Jozu using an Armament Haki imbued slam shattered Aokichi, and when Aokichi reformed, he was visibly hurt. So how can this make sense if we're saying that the reason why attacks don't hurt Aokichi in the first place is because ice doesn't have the property of being able to be hurt? Again, to understand this, you need to remember what a Logia actually is. Aokichi is literally the element of ice, but he's also actually a human. He is an ice human. But the problem is, the human part of him is buried at a metaphysical level within the ice. So normal attacks like Nico Robin's clutch can only interact with Aokichi at a physical level. Thus they can only interact with the ice part of him that cannot be hurt. These normal attacks that can only act at a physical level do not have the ability to interact with the human part of Aokichi that can be hurt, because this part of him is buried within the ice at a metaphysical level. So to actually hurt Aokichi, you need a special method that is able to interact with him beyond just a physical level. You need to be able to interact with his essence beyond the ice, and Armament Haki provides this means of interaction. That is why Jozu using a physical attack was able to hurt Aokichi, whereas Nico Robin could not, because Armament Haki allowed Jozu to interact with the human essence rather than just the ice. And as you also now should understand, this is also why even attacks with special mechanisms like Scratchman Apple's attacks, which automatically passes the first obstacle of being able to interact with Kizaru's body, was still not able to hurt Kizaru, because again, it was only able to physically interact with Kizaru, and thus could only interact with the light part of Kizaru. To actually hurt Kizaru, Scratchman's Apple's attack would need the additional property of being able to interact with the human essence of Kizaru that is buried within the light at a metaphysical level. So when you see things like Rayleigh cutting Kizaru's cheek using an Armament Haki sword attack, know that two things are happening. Firstly, the Haki is allowing his sword to physically interact with light as if it were a solid, instead of just going right through, as we saw when Brook tried to cut Kizaru or when a random guy fired a bullet at Kizaru. And secondly, the Haki allows the sword to interact with the human essence of Kizaru that is buried within the light at a metaphysical level, thus actually hurting Kizaru and making him bleed. And an elemental weakness such as Luffy or Rubberman being able to actually hit and actually hurt in LA Lightning Man, and because rubber doesn't conduct electricity, is just a special rule that Oda added to have this Haki-like interaction effect without having to use Haki for some Logias. Now the second function of Armament Haki is the modification function. Now we generally call this modification process coating, and it is literally just the process of imbuing your Haki into or onto a thing. Post time skip, this coating process is typically represented by a black color, as you can see here. But pre-time skip, no special color was employed to represent its use, as you can see with Rayleigh fighting Kizaru and with Garp using his Fist of Love. And there doesn't seem to be any special restriction on the things that you can coat. For example, you can coat any part of your body such as your fist, your forehead, or even your full body. You can also coat accessory equipment such as knives, swords, or even a random bamboo stick. You can even coat projectiles such as the arrows we see with the Kuja tribe, bullets as we see with Ben Bettman, and even literal spit as we see with Alpaca Man. And all Devil Fruit users can imbue their Haki into their powers, even when used as projectiles or even if not in direct contact at all. For example, we see Katakuri coating his accessory Mochi arms without even touching them in the first place. Now Armament Haki modifies a thing in two ways. Firstly, it grants the interaction function that we described before to a thing. So this is why, for example, Ben Bettman can use a gun to threaten Kizaru when we know that normal bullets can't even touch Kizaru in the first place. The second way Armament Haki modifies a thing is that it strengthens it, and we generally call this process of strengthening hardening. Now we don't have a specific baseline multiplier of how much Armament Haki increases the strength of a thing by, but to give you a baseline indication of how much it does, consider that average tier Haki from an average side character like Margaret, when applied to literally a normal arrow, is able to increase the power of this normal arrow to casually destroy a rock and the ground beneath it. And Haki routinely gets stronger the more you train it and in the extremes of battle. So this is why Virgo can use a literally ordinary bamboo stick as a strong weapon against Smoker. Now in the modification section, I highlighted the modification of an already existing thing, for example coating a fist or a bamboo stick. And the fact that these things are strengthened, that would obviously produce more powerful attacks than if they weren't. But that is just basic armament haki that anyone who knows armament haki can do. But at a more advanced level, you can use your haki to create a primary armament haki attack. What I mean by this is rather than relying on the coated thing itself as the medium of an attack, you instead just allow your haki to flow out and the raw flowing haki itself serves as the medium for the attack. And as you can see, one of the cool features of advanced armament haki is that because you are using haki flow, you can hit an opponent without actually physically touching them. Now the first stage of this advanced level of armament haki is called emission. And emission is just using the haki flow to attack an opponent from the outside. We see this for example when Sentomaru attacked Luffy without actually touching him, and also when Rayleigh pushed back this giant elephant without actually touching it. But at an even higher level than emission, we have what is called internal destruction. So as with emission, internal destruction works via the flow of haki itself towards the opponent. But the crucial difference between the two of them is that with emission, the haki impacts the opponent from the outside, whereas with internal destruction, the haki literally bypasses the opponent's exterior and goes directly inside of them and then destroys them from the inside. We saw both Rayleigh and Luffy destroy an explosive color from the inside by using this advanced form of haki. And again, it is by using armament haki internal destruction that Luffy was first able to hurt Kaido. Now as we have already mentioned in the modification section, anything you coat in haki gets stronger. Thus a person coating a body part or even their full body with armament haki would obviously increase their defense. This increase in durability granted by armament haki is one of the reasons high level swordsmen routinely coat their swords in haki, because at the most basic level it prevents the swords from being destroyed. And when you're at even higher levels, it prevents even the smallest of nicks. So as Rayleigh said, it's good to think of it as equipping an external suit of armor. And of course, as we mentioned in the primary attack section, you can release a flow of your haki to attack. So it would obviously also make sense that you can also use this haki flow to defend. We see this for example when Sentomaru was easily able to defend against Luffy's attack without it actually touching him. And this is also the same method that the admirals used at Marineford to defend the platform against Whitebeard's Skyquake. But remember, haki also has an interact function. So what this means passively for defense is that haki is not only able to defend against physical attacks, but it is also able to defend against certain non-physical attacks. For example, we know that strong haki prevents force spatial manipulation techniques like Law's force teleportation. This was explicitly stated in the fight against Kaido. And we know that strong haki also prevents soul manipulation techniques like Law's soul switch. Given that, like the force teleportation, Law would have obviously done the soul switch to Big Mom or Kaido if he could. Now let us get into Conqueror haki techniques, which remember is just any technique done from Conqueror's haki. Now as we have already described before, there are two classes of techniques that you can do with Conqueror's haki. So you have coating or infusion techniques, as well as spirit or will subjugation techniques. And as we already described before from the armament haki section, coating or infusion techniques include hardening, emission, and internal destruction. Now there seems to be a misconception by some people who think you can't do emission or internal destruction with Conqueror's haki. Now this misconception mainly stems from a lack of understanding, where some people don't understand the difference between haki, the fundamental energy with at least two types, and haki techniques, the different ways in which you can use haki. Remember, things like hardening and emission and internal destruction are applications or ways in which you use Haki. They themselves are merely processes which you learn. So given that Luffy already learned how to carry out those processes, when he realized that he can infuse not only normal Haki, but he can also infuse even Conqueror's Haki, all he simply did was change the fundamental energy type that he was using to carry out those processes or techniques from normal Haki to Conqueror's Haki. Again, it's similar to how in Naruto, jutsus are the techniques of chakra, and you have two different types of chakra: regular chakra, which is mental energy and physical energy, and sage chakra, which is mental energy, physical energy, and nature energy. So if you are like Naruto and you already learned the process by which you carried out the technique of a Rasengan, you can do the same jutsu with either regular chakra or sage chakra. Because remember, the process of how you carry out a Rasengan remains the same. He's merely changing the chakra type that he uses to carry out the Rasengan. Another reason why some people make this mistake is because they think of the word coat as being exclusively synonymous with the basic Haki use method or application known as hardening. Now again, this is just incorrect. As I had already explained to you before, coat or coating and infuse or infusion are the synonymous general terms that encompass all the techniques of hardening, emission, and internal destruction. So for example, you'll note that Hyogoro uses the word coating when he's clearly talking about internal destruction. So when Luffy uses the word coat when talking to Kaido about Conqueror's Haki, that does not mean he can only use it to harden. No, it means the same thing as infusion, which again is a shorthand which describes all three of these techniques. So with Conqueror's Haki coating or infusion, you can basically do anything you can do with Armament Haki. And remember, Armament Haki is just a term which describes normal Haki derived coating or infusion techniques. And it should be noted that Conqueror's Haki coating or infusion is way more powerful than Armament Haki. So compared to before, where even a Gear 4 Armament Haki internal destruction Luffy could not really do much discernible damage to Kaido, a base crude Conqueror's Haki internal destruction Luffy is visibly shown to be way stronger than our prior advanced Armament Haki Gear 4 Luffy, now doing significant damage to Kaido in his hybrid form, which remember is Kaido's strongest and most durable state. And as we had already mentioned before, you can use Conqueror's Haki coating or infusion together with Armament Haki to make any attack even more powerful. But remember, there are also techniques that you can do with Conqueror's Haki that you can't do with normal Haki. The first of these techniques is for the subjugation of an opponent's will or spirit, and this is the most basic level of Conqueror's Haki that anyone who has already awakened their Conqueror's Haki can do. And these will or spirit subjugation techniques operate on a spectrum from basic domination of an opponent's will or spirit to complete incapacitation. Now, domination is the lowest level of the will or spirit subjugation spectrum, and it basically just speaks to breaking the will of an opponent, causing them to stand down. We first saw the use of this in chapter 1 of One Piece, where Shanks, just by looking at a Sea King, caused it to stop its assault and run away. And since then, we've seen this countless other times on other animals. For example, at Fishman Island, we can see here where Luffy used this domination function of Conqueror's Haki to easily break the spirit of a violent sea squirrel, causing it to stop its assault and become docile. It is also important to note that after using this domination function to break the will of an opponent, the opponent may end up losing consciousness a little while after. But this loss of consciousness is not a direct result of the domination, but rather it is the result of the buildup of the sheer fear that they feel after having just been dominated. Now at the highest level of the will or spirit subjugation spectrum, we have incapacitation, and this generally speaks to a Conqueror's Haki user making an opponent go completely unconscious through a complete overpowering of their will. We saw this for example at Fishman Island, where Luffy completely knocked out over 50,000 fishmen in an instant through the use of this incapacitation function. Now as you can see, when using incapacitation, it generally operates like an outward extension of the willpower that knocks everyone that can be knocked out in a specific circular area. However, even in a crowded area, a sufficiently skilled Conqueror's Haki user can actually specifically select who they want to knock out and who should be left alone, as demonstrated by Rayleigh when he rescued Kami from Disco. Now, for those of you who like cross-anime battles, the most interesting thing about this will or spirit subjugation function of Conqueror's Haki is, well, what determines who it can work on. And in SBS volume 65, Oda actually explains this. He says being able to knock an enemy out with Conqueror's Haki depends entirely on having an overwhelming power gap between the two. And so a Conqueror's Haki user is able to knock out anyone who, in comparison to their own level, is so weak that they aren't even worth fighting. But what a lot of people fail to understand about Conqueror's Haki incapacitation is that weak here is not referencing how strong your attacks are or how physically strong you are, but rather it is referencing how strong your will is. Because remember, Conqueror's Haki incapacitation is literally the overpowering of a character's will. So this is why when Rayleigh used his Conqueror's Haki indiscriminately, strong-willed characters like Law and Captain Kidd could stay conscious, even though their actual attack power at the time was immeasurably lower than that of Rayleigh. And as it relates to cross-verse battles, take a character like Tsunade for example. When we first met Tsunade, she obviously still had her Sannin level strength, and thus she was still physically one of the strongest characters at the time, comparable to Jiraiya and Orochimaru. However, despite her Sannin level physical strength, she was still mentally weak, given that at the time, she was still traumatized by certain prior experiences, and thus all it took to break her down mentally was the mere sight of blood. Because remember, how strong you are physically or how strong of an attack you can do does not always correspond to how strong you are mentally or how strong your will is. So Tsunade at this time, despite her legendary Sannin level physical strength, her will was still weak. Thus she would obviously be susceptible to Conqueror's Haki incapacitation, because remember, what is important with Conqueror's Haki incapacitation is not how physically strong you are or how strong of an attack you can do, but rather what is important is how strong your will is. Because remember, as we said before, Conqueror's Haki incapacitation is literally an overpowering, not of a character's physical strength, and not of whatever, however strong of an attack they can do, but rather it is an overpowering of their will. Also, what I find to be absolutely silly is when some people try to make the case that strong One Piece characters are just completely defenseless against similar will, spirit, or mind subjugation techniques. Like take Ryatsu Crush from Bleach for example. Similar to Conqueror's Haki, it has been shown to overpower the will or spirit of an opponent. In the case of Captain Yamamoto using it against Nano, even the same foaming at the mouth is used when he made her go unconscious. So it's obviously silly to say that techniques like Ryatsu Crush would work on strong One Piece characters when we know for a fact that strong One Piece characters are absolutely resistant to Conqueror's Haki domination and incapacitation, which have similar effects. And even techniques like Genjutsu, which you can say is able to trap someone in their mind, even if it could potentially work on someone without chakra, to say it could trap a sufficiently strong Conqueror's Haki user is just silly. Like even in Wano, we see where Luffy was knocked completely unconscious by Kaido, but even in this completely unconscious state, Luffy's Conqueror's Haki was still active and knocked out the people who were trying to get close to him. Conqueror's Haki works independent of the user's conscious state, because again remember, it is as Rayleigh described, the user's very spirit manifests. So to try to make the case that mind alteration techniques like Genjutsu could unequivocally trap a sufficiently powerful Conqueror's Haki user is a drastic underestimation of how strong the will of a Conqueror's Haki user actually is. Now in the domination and incapacitation section, what we were basically talking about is the application of pressure to an opponent's will or spirit using Conqueror's Haki. But this same form of Conqueror's Haki can also be used to apply pressure onto the external environment. We first saw this when Shanks visited Whitebeard on his ship. You'll note that Shanks, by merely walking on the ship, his Conqueror's Haki was incapacitating the weaker members of Whitebeard's crew. But what's important to note here is that his Haki is so strong that even in this form, it was not only pressuring the will of Whitebeard's crew, but it was also causing pressure to the ship itself, resulting in the cracks that you see. Now again, let's be very clear here. This was not the effect of some Conqueror's Haki induced shockwave. No, Shanks' literal willpower itself is so strong that it is causing actual physical damage to the environment. Again, to try to make the case that characters like this have no mental resistance is beyond silly. Now we also see a similar external pressure when there's a clash between two people who have Conqueror's Haki. This clash generates some black lightning and causes pressure effects, which also damages the external environment. We see this for example in the Luffy vs Katakuri fight where their Conqueror's Haki was clashing. You could clearly see the mirror world terrain being destroyed, and of course those around them who were within the range of this Conqueror's Haki were also being incapacitated. And when there's a clash between two particularly strong Conqueror's Haki users, the range and power exuded extends such that even the heavens themselves become split. We first saw this when Shanks and Whitebeard, who are two Emperors of the Sea, clash, then Big Mom and Kaido, and finally Roger vs Prime Whitebeard. And now Luffy has finally reached the stage where his Conqueror's Haki is strong enough to cause the splitting of the sky when clashing with Kaido. But anyway, that's the video guys. Hopefully this helped to give you a better understanding of Haki and its techniques. And let me know what you thought of the video in the comment section down below. But anyway, see you guys next time.